In the jungle, you're at war with society. Every day is a balance between preservation.
What is yours going to be?
Manhattan, New York. The clock hit 2:47 in the afternoon on a quiet Saturday, October 10th, 1964. Mayme Johnson, 58, and her kid, Ruthie, 29, pushed through the heavy brass doors of Bergmann Sterling, a high-end joint on Fifth Avenue that served the city's top earners and had only just recently started letting black folks through the door, grudgingly ending years of a strict whites-only operation. These dames were dressed to kill. Mayme wore a sharp navy suit, dripping in pearls like a queen. On her arm, a leather bag worth more scratch than a Harlem family sees in a quarter of a year. Ruthie rocked a cream dress and white gloves, not a hair out of place, holding her own against the socialite wives who spent their husbands' money there every week. They walked in cool and collected, eyeing the imported goods and designer threads, moving with the swagger of women holding a heavy wallet, knowing exactly what top tier looked like. A clerk stepped up to them, a move confirmed by every witness on the floor that day, and asked what they needed, keeping it polite. Mayme laid it out plain and simple. They needed evening gear for a big night out and wanted to see the best merchandise in the house. The girl, a young white kid, looked jumpy about dealing with black clientele, but she kept her cool, doing her job and pulling out the new fall lineup for inspection. For about 15 minutes, business went on as usual, quiet and smooth. Mayme and Ruthie felt the material, talked numbers, and debated the cuts and colors, speaking like pros, educated and refined, clearly veterans of high-class shopping, even if joints like Bergmann and Sterling had just opened the gates to them. A few white patrons threw glances their way, some just curious about the newcomers, others barely hiding their disgust. But back in October 1964, with the Civil Rights Act inked 3 months prior in July, most folks knew the score. Public disrespect was against the rules now, even if they hated the idea of sharing their exclusive turf with black customers. Then, Charles Whitfield Pemberton III marched in at 3:02 in the afternoon. Pemberton, a hard man of 64 years that October, was a real estate shark who inherited 12 million smackers from his grandfather's shipping hall, and he flipped that stake into a massive empire worth 45 million large by ruthlessly grabbing Manhattan real estate. He held the keys to 19 midtown towers, ran projects all over the city, and sat at the head table of 3 different banks, and ran 2 country clubs that barely tolerated a few token Jewish members. Only because the law forced their hand, while still keeping black folks out with cheap excuses, and New York's top bosses knew him as a guy who built his mountain of cash, partly by denying leases to what he called undesirables, his code for black families, Puerto Ricans, or anyone he figured didn't belong in high-class Manhattan society. Pemberton stepped into Bergmann Sterling just to collect his custom suits. But when he clocked 2 sharp-looking black women by the evening wear rack, checking out high-dollar dresses with a white clerk serving them, his face turned blood red with a rage that witnesses called instant and explosive. What went down next, confirmed by 7 patrons and 3 employees, who saw the showdown and sang to the New York Observer. Between October 11th and 13th, 1964, was a show of hate so raw, so public and nasty that even the customers who agreed with his twisted views were rattled by Pemberton's actions, especially when the Civil Rights Act had supposedly changed the game. The law had drawn a hard line, making that kind of prejudice bad for business and against the rules. Pemberton marched straight at Mayme and Ruthie, his voice climbing the ladder with every heavy step, until he was barking loud enough to make sure every soul in the joint caught every single word he spit out, the filth he spewed, the slurs and the dirt he threw at 2 dames he didn't know, ain't fit for a morning paper. But the folks watching heard a playlist that included the ugliest names in the book, declaring that colored folks had no business walking, into a joint built for white society, calling the Civil Rights Act a communist hustle that was wrecking America, threatening to have the bulls haul them in for disturbing the peace, accusing them of pinching the cash they were holding, claiming there was no way they earned that kind of scratch honestly enough for Bergmann and Sterling, and taking shots at their looks until both women were broken down to tears. He threw every dirty name in the book at them, says Margaret Holbrook, 50 years old, who was just looking for a baptism dress for her grandkid when the beef started. Holbrook talked to the Observer on October 12, 1964, from her place on the Upper East Side. "I've been in New York all my life, and I came up hearing that kind of talk. It was standard back in the day, sad to say. But by October 1964, with the movement shifting gears and the Civil Rights Act passing just 3 months back, most folks know you don't run your mouth like that, especially not out in the open. But Charles Pemberton didn't give a damn. He was screaming at those two dames, calling them animals, saying they were dirtying up the store just by standing there, claiming the Civil Rights Act was a sham and that the bosses should have the right to turn away whoever they wanted, demanding they beat it before he tossed them out himself. The two women, the older, broad, and the kid, just stood there taking the heat, not saying a word, not fighting back, trying to keep their heads up while getting dragged through the mud by a guy acting like a total animal. Pemberton didn't stop at running his mouth. Witnesses say he snatched a dress Ruthie was looking at, a $650 gown of French silk, and threw it on the floor like trash, saying it was dead stock now that a colored woman touched it and that he'd cover the cost if the store torched it instead of trying to peddle tainted goods. He demanded the floor boss come out and explain why these people were let through the doors, seeing as they didn't belong in a joint serving the Manhattan high life. He threatened to pull his business from Bergmann and Sterling unless the management went back to the old rules of keeping colored customers out. The whole beef lasted maybe 5 minutes, but it felt like an hour, says Robert Chen, 42, a worker who saw the whole thing go down. Chen told the Observer on October 13, 1964, Mr. Pemberton was completely off the leash, shouting that hateful garbage, while the two women just stood there and took it in silence. The older dame looked like she wanted to fire back, but was holding her tongue on purpose, like she knew starting a war would only bring more heat. The younger one was crying, completely wrecked by the words thrown at her. The other customers stood around, rubbernecking, and most looked shaky, but nobody stepped in. Nobody told Pemberton to zip it. Nobody backed those women up. We all just watched while this rich guy crushed their pride right in the middle of the floor. Finally, after 5 to 7 minutes of relentless hammering, Mayme Johnson took her girl's hand and walked toward the exit, with her chin up, refusing to run or show anything but cold, hard class. Tears were streaming down their faces, but Pemberton didn't let up, chasing them right to the exit. He kept spitting insults and filth at their backs until their heels hit the pavement outside. Holbrook remembers the guy's parting shot vividly. The Civil Rights Act don't mean a thing in the real world. You don't belong in this neighborhood, and you sure as hell don't belong in my store. I don't care what those commies in Washington tell you. He stood there, blocking the doorway, screaming at them while they retreated down the block. It was the ugliest scene I ever laid eyes on, especially for 1964. We were supposed to be done with that kind of garbage, but Charles Pemberton was blind. Nobody in Bergmann and Sterling had a clue what was coming. It took 72 hours for the bill to come due. He had just signed his own death warrant. Those women he dragged through the mud weren't just random nobodies he could kick around. They belonged to Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson, the heavy hitter, the most dangerous man in Harlem, a man fresh out of federal lockup, back on the streets since November 1963. He spent that year tightening the screws, rebuilding his empire brick by brick. Now he was untouchable again, one of the biggest players in New York City, legit or otherwise. And Bumpy? He was about to teach Charles Whitfield Pemberton III the true cost of disrespect, a lesson that would bankrupt the man's entire life. Saturday evening, October 10th, 1964. "Daddy, he called us animals." Mayme and Ruthie Johnson walked into Bumpy's office, top floor of the Palm Cafe on 125th, 4:30 p.m., Saturday, October 10th. Both of them were rattling like leaves in the wind after the scene at Bergmann Sterling. It had only been 90 minutes. William "Bub" Hewlett, the man on the door, saw it all. Johnson's right-hand muscle. He was standing guard when the ladies came in. Mayme tried to play it cool at first. She didn't want to put that weight on her husband's shoulders. She knew trouble meant heat, especially with the feds watching him so soon after his release. Mayme walked in, wearing a mask of calm, Hewlett told the Observer later that week. But Ruthie? She was a mess of tears. Bumpy took one hard look at his little girl's face. He knew the score immediately. He asked for the report. Mayme tried to brush it off. She called it a little dust-up at a store, just business as usual for folks like them. Even in '64, civil rights or not, but Bumpy didn't let up. He pressed until Ruthie spilled the ugly truth. She told him about the guy at Bergmann Sterling, the one screaming filth in their faces, the names he called them, how he threw the clothes on the floor like they were poison, how he stripped their dignity in front of a packed store while everyone just watched. Hewlett said Johnson didn't make a sound. He listened to every word in stone-cold silence. His face was a mask. The only tell was a slight twitch around the eyes. Anyone who knew Bumpy knew that look meant murder. When Ruthie finished the story, Johnson asked one simple thing. Did anyone get this man's name? Mayme said no. They were too busy trying to walk out with their heads high. ID wasn't on their mind. But she remembered the manager trying to calm the guy down. Mr. Pemberton. The guy wouldn't settle. He was bragging about owning buildings in Manhattan, and he was there for custom suits. That meant he was a regular, a man with deep pockets. Johnson gave a slow nod, processing the intel. Hewlett heard him clearly. Go home, rest up, look after Ruthie. Forget this ever happened. I'll handle it. The way he said it. Hewlett recalled the temperature dropping in the room. It was cold, controlled. I knew right then somebody was going to pay a heavy price. Bumpy was a family man, warm, protective. He loved his own. But you cross his blood? Bumpy became a nightmare walking. He was stone cold, laser-focused, a nightmare for anyone who knew the real weight of his power. Once he marked a man for ruin. The moment Mayme and Ruthie cleared the room, Johnson hit the phone lines, dialing Theodore Green, his mouthpiece, and rattling the cages of his business partners, reaching out to every source with dirt on Manhattan real estate and backroom dealings. By 6 p.m. that Saturday, Johnson had the target in his sights, Charles Whitfield Pemberton III. He mapped out the guy's $45 million empire, his ugly reputation for bigotry, his high society pals, his assets, and best of all, his soft spots. The cracks where a man with enough leverage and the will to use it could burn down everything Pemberton stood for. Bumpy made near 20 calls that Saturday, Green told the Observer back in October 1964. He was digging for skeletons, grilling people on how Pemberton ran his shop, learning who his partners were, who held his debt, what brick and mortar he owned, what he owed, and what deals were on the table. Bumpy was scouting the battlefield, sharpening his blade, figuring out exactly how to bleed Pemberton dry in a way that wouldn't just hurt, but would never lead back to his doorstep. And what Bumpy found was that Pemberton's riches, big as they looked, were a house of cards, built on massive leverage and borrowed time, heavy debt to float his projects, leaving him hooked on the banks, keeping the tap open, just to stay afloat. By Sunday morning, October 11th, 1964, Johnson had the blueprint ready to dismantle Charles Pemberton's empire brick by brick, his standing in town, and his name. The hit would go down over 72 hours, pulling in Johnson's outfit, his clean business ties, his friends in high places, and his know-how of how the Manhattan big shots played the game, in the wake of the Civil Rights Act, where being an open bigot was becoming a costly liability to your wallet and your status. Bumpy's brilliance wasn't just that he'd crush anyone who touched his family. Green put it plain, his genius was knowing exactly how to make the punishment fit the crime, to deliver a personal blow that shattered them without leaving a single fingerprint. Pemberton used his influence and hate to disrespect Bumpy's wife and little girl. So Bumpy was going to use that same weight to wreck Pemberton completely, sending a loud message to every other bigoted suit in Manhattan. The Civil Rights Act ain't just paper, and coming at black folks, especially those under Bumpy Johnson's wing, carries a price that'll bury you. Come Sunday morning, Johnson started working the phones with his partners and political friends, laying out the insult to his family and calling in favors for a job that needed total silence and perfect timing. Word on the street is Johnson dropped near $75,000 in the next 72 hours, not on bribes or street hustles, but on clean deals and tactical moves that were strictly legal, yet executed with the precision of a surgeon to cripple Pemberton's interests. Then came the banks. Johnson had an in with 3 banks operating in Harlem that held heavy notes on Pemberton's projects. Working through middlemen, Johnson made sure those banks got the hard numbers, facts that were dead accurate, but stacked in a way to make Pemberton's books look shakier than a leaf in a storm. Bumpy had his crew run a deep audit on Pemberton, says Green. The reports were solid, not a single lie in the pile, but they shone a harsh light on the danger of Pemberton's debt, exposed his addiction to easy credit, and flagged the projects that were already lagging behind. And way over budget. But the real problem? They noted Pemberton's public mouth on October 10th, down at Bergmann Sterling, violated the code, and maybe the law of the Civil Rights Act, and could drag any bank holding his paper into a PR nightmare and a legal minefield. This intelligence landed on the desks of the loan sharks at those 3 banks by Sunday afternoon, along with a friendly whisper that they might want to take a hard look at their stake in Pemberton, considering the hazards involved. Come Monday morning, October 12th, all 3 banks started auditing Pemberton's loans, not because anyone put a gun to their head, but because the dirt Johnson dug up made the suits nervous about how deep their bank was in, with a builder who was tapped out and showed the kind of loud prejudice that was becoming poison by October 1964. Then came the sit-down with the organizations. Johnson had ties with a few outfits fighting for rights in New York, crews he'd thrown cash at before, despite his criminal record, because he respected what they were trying to build, and because backing the cause bought him some political insurance and gave him a standing in the community through his connections in those circles. Johnson made sure Pemberton became the bullseye for the movement's anger, not with a lead pipe or a shakedown, but through strictly by-the-book protests, freezing his trade and shining a light. Bumpy reached out to the heavy hitters at CORE, the NAACP, the local crews, and he let them know exactly how Pemberton stepped out of line on October 10th. According to Reverend James Mitchell, 71, a Harlem preacher tight with the organization, who had a sit-down with the Observer on October 13th, 1964. Bumpy handed over the full file on Pemberton's crooked, bigoted business habits, how he froze out black families, his long history of hate, and that public mess at Bergmann Sterling. And Bumpy, he offered to bankroll the operation, directed right at Pemberton's brick and mortar, right at his wallet. The organizations were wary at first about taking cash from a known gangster, but Bumpy made it plain he didn't want the wheel or the glory. He just wanted to back real action against a bigoted businessman who had a lesson coming to him. They took the envelope and started drawing up the battle plans. Then came the squeeze on his partners. Pemberton had associates in his deals, fat cats who parked their cash with him, expecting a heavy return. Johnson used his grapevine to make sure these partners got the word, hinting that Pemberton's big mouth was about to become a serious debt on their ledger, that the movement was gearing up to hit Pemberton's properties hard, and that they might want to pull their chips off the table before the stink ruined their own good names. It wasn't a threat, and it wasn't a lie, Green explains. It was just the cold, hard truth about what the organizations were actually plotting to execute pickets, freezes on trade, bad ink in the papers, along with a nudge that staying in bed with Pemberton while he was under fire for his hate might be bad for their own bottom line. The partners got the memo from guys they trusted, and they started grilling Pemberton about his trouble with the people, his ability to keep a lid on the bad press, and his strategy for the storm headed his way. Pemberton was forced to spend Sunday and Monday talking his shaky partners off the ledge, which kept him from actually running his shop and made the whole thing smell like a disaster, even though the war hadn't even started yet. The media blitz. Johnson had an in with several black newspapers, and with the white reporters who kept an eye on Harlem and the rights issues in New York. Through those channels, Johnson made sure the story of the Bergmann and Sterling incident hit the front page. It was a ledger of Pemberton's dirty dealings and how he spat on the Civil Rights Act of 1964, a Manhattan big shot who kept freezing people out, thinking the rules didn't apply to him. The word hit the black papers on Sunday, October 11th, and the white presses by Monday, October 12th. The New York Amsterdam News plastered it on the front page. Manhattan developer screams racist abuse at black shoppers and throws clothing on the floor. Even the New York Times ran a piece, tucked on page 12 of the Monday edition, allegations of discrimination at Fifth Avenue Boutique. After the dust-up, the papers didn't print Mayme and Ruthie's names right away. Johnson kept his family out of the spotlight, but the ink painted a clear enough picture. Anybody inside Bergmann and Sterling on October 10th knew exactly who went down. Monday morning, the real squeeze started, aiming to shake the foundation of Pemberton's business and crush his name in town. The protests kicked off sharp at 9 a.m. On Monday, October 12th, 50 bodies stood tall, organized by CORE and the NAACP. They staked out Pemberton's big building on West 86th Street, holding signs that said, "Pemberton discriminates against black tenants, racist landlord violates, Civil Rights Act, and justice for all, no exceptions." They passed out flyers to every soul walking by, laying out Pemberton's act at Bergmann and Sterling and his habit of shutting doors on black families. 2 other Pemberton joints got hit Monday, the crowds keeping it peaceful but heavy. It drew the cameras and brought the kind of heat a businessman hates around how Pemberton made his coin. It was strictly legal and deadly effective, says Reverend Mitchell. Nobody blocked a door, nobody made a threat, they just held the pavement, holding their ground and passing the word. But the impact was like a sledgehammer. Just like that, Pemberton's bricks and mortar smelled like racism and trouble. Tenants didn't want in, and Pemberton's partners started sweating in their suits, scared to be seen with a guy with a target painted on his back. Then came the tenants. Johnson put up the cash for the organizers. They rallied the people in Pemberton's buildings, folks tired of living in rot, paying hike after hike, and taking the abuse because they had nowhere else to go. Monday night, October 12th, 200 souls from 9 of Pemberton's spots gathered in a Harlem church and organized into a single fist. They announced the plan: rent strikes and calling down the city inspectors, dragging him into court unless Pemberton cleaned up his act right then and there, and cut the prejudice. Bumpy bankrolled the paper for the flyers, paid for a mouthpiece to teach them the new Civil Rights Act, and covered the rent for the church meeting, says Reverend Mitchell. Bumpy didn't want his name on the marquee. He just wanted Pemberton to bleed for how he looked down on black folks. Not just the insult to Bumpy's blood, but for years of stepping on tenants who couldn't throw a punch alone, but could break him together if someone handed them the tools. The country club angle. Pemberton sat in two high-end Manhattan clubs, places that shut out black and Jewish members, only letting a few Jewish guys in lately, because the law and the streets were putting the squeeze on them. Using cutouts, Johnson made sure both clubs got a full dossier, all about Pemberton's little show at Bergmann Sterling on October 10th, about the mobs outside his buildings, about the tenants unionizing, and the papers screaming racism. Those clubs were walking on thin ice in October 1964. Green breaks it down plain. The Civil Rights Act hit the books 3 months prior, and every exclusive club was sweating under the pressure to integrate. They were walking a tightrope between the old guard, who wanted to keep the gates locked tight, and a new legal world where shutting people out was becoming a headache they couldn't afford to defend. What Pemberton pulled, screaming filth at black women right out in the open street, was exactly the kind of loudmouth behavior that put a target on these clubs' backs for criticism and dragged them into court battles. The message was delivered to the club boards loud and clear. Hints were dropped that keeping a guy like Pemberton while civil rights groups were hunting him down might shine a spotlight on the club's own dirty little secrets regarding who gets in and who doesn't. By Monday night, one country club politely told Pemberton to hand in his membership card, just so the establishment could wash its hands of a mess that had nothing to do with golf. The second club put Pemberton on ice, keeping his status under review while they sniffed around the accusations. Come Tuesday morning, October 13th, the weight of the world crashing down from every side had turned Pemberton's business empire into a burning building with no exits. Then the banks came knocking. 2 of the 3 outfits that looked at their loans to Pemberton decided to pull the plug, demanding $9 million in cash on the barrelhead immediately. They used the fine print in the contracts that let a bank squeeze a guy for payment if they decided the borrower's pockets were looking a little too empty for their liking, or if the guy's behavior on the street was making the bank look bad by association. Strictly speaking, the loans were callable, Green explains with a cold stare. The paperwork gave the banks the muscle to demand their cash back if they judged. The situation had turned sour. Bumpy's little whisper campaign had the banks convinced that Pemberton's heavy debt, mixed with the heat from the civil rights marches and all that bad press, was a gamble they wouldn't take, so they pulled the trigger on the loans. Pemberton didn't have $9 million in loose cash lying around, meaning he had to dump properties fast, for pennies on the dollar, or go begging for money at rates that would bleed him dry, all while his name was mud, tied to racism and violating people's rights all over town. Then the partners ran. 4 of Pemberton's associates made it clear on Tuesday they were walking away from the joint deals, claiming they didn't like how Pemberton handled the heat, and worrying the bad headlines would kill the profits. When those partners walked out, it forced Pemberton to buy their shares, draining what little blood he had left in the bank, or try to find new fools willing to throw cash into construction jobs that were suddenly swimming in protests and trouble. Then the tenant strike hit Tuesday evening. They announced a rent freeze in 4 of Pemberton's joints, with about 150 families, locking their rent money in escrow accounts instead of handing it over to Pemberton. Until he fixed the place and stopped the hate, that strike froze about $60,000 a month and caused a legal headache, forcing Pemberton to lawyer up to fight eviction battles, cases he would usually crush in his sleep. But now it was an uphill war, with the tenants having real lawyers and the papers on their side. Then came the cold shoulder from Manhattan's elite. Families who used to drink with Pemberton started quietly backing away on Tuesday, turning down dinners, scratching his name off guest lists, making it crystal clear, through quiet but deadly signals, that Pemberton's public hate show in October 1964, 3 months after the Civil Rights Act passed, had made him a pariah. In circles trying to survive the New World Order, even if they were still bigots behind closed doors, the freeze-out was fast and brutal. According to Margaret Holbrook, a dame who saw the Bergmann and Sterling mess firsthand and ran in the same high-class pack as Pemberton. Come Tuesday, word had hit the streets. Everybody knew exactly what Charles pulled on Saturday. Some folks were actually disgusted. Others, they didn't give a damn about the hate in his heart, but they hated the noise he made. Screaming in a store, tossing clothes on the floor like a lunatic, making a scene for the papers. In October 1964, you don't act that way without paying the price. The laws changed. The streets changed. The rules aren't what they used to be. Maybe back in '54, Charles could have walked away from that stunt on October 10th, but in '64, it's a death sentence. By the time Tuesday evening rolled around, Charles was getting iced out of every room in town. Guys who broke bread with him for decades were suddenly too tied up to take a meeting. Wednesday, October 14th, 1964. Who put the hit on me? By the morning of Wednesday, October 14th, Pemberton's empire was bleeding out. The banks wanted $9 million, and they wanted it right now. Partners walked away from the table. Tenants refused to pay a dime. Protesters crowded his front steps every day. The papers were printing headlines about his dirty laundry and his racist business habits. One club kicked him out for good. The other put him on ice. His people left him to rot, and the poor guy didn't even know why the roof caved in. Everything crumbled all at once. Word from the guys close to Pemberton says he spent Wednesday working the phones in a panic, trying to figure out who pulled the trigger, why the banks called in the debt, why his partners lost their nerve, why the activists painted a target on his back specifically when half the landlords in Manhattan were doing the exact same dirt. A few guys he called brought up the mess at Bergmann and Sterling on October 10th, the protests that started Monday, the heat he was getting from the press. The worry was that anyone standing next to Pemberton would get dirty just by association. He became the poster boy for racism in this new America. But nobody said the name Bumpy Johnson, because Johnson kept his hands clean. Every move made against Pemberton was strictly by the book, handled by middlemen who couldn't be traced back to the boss. Pemberton didn't know this was a setup, let alone a hit ordered by the husband of the women he disrespected at Bergmann and Sterling just 4 days prior. That changed Wednesday afternoon. Pemberton got a visitor at his Midtown office from a man named Theodore Green. He introduced himself as a lawyer, representing certain business interests in Harlem. I walked into his office around 2:30 that Wednesday, October 14th. Green told the papers Pemberton looked like a wreck, unshaven, wearing the same wrinkled suit he'd been sweating in for 2 days, eyes red from no sleep. He was buried under a mountain of financial papers, glued to the phone, begging for cash to cover the loans. When I walked in, he didn't even look up. He said, "Whatever you're selling, I ain't interested. I got fires everywhere." And I told him, "I know. I'm here to tell you exactly who lit the match." Green laid it out for him. The business collapsing, the friends disappearing. It wasn't bad luck. It was payback for what he did to Mayme and Ruthie Johnson at Bergmann and Sterling on October 10th. I looked him in the eye. "Last Saturday, you shamed 2 women on Fifth Avenue. You screamed your hate at them for everyone to hear. You threw clothes on the floor like trash. You called the new laws communist garbage. You kicked them out. But those women? That was the wife and daughter of Ellsworth Johnson, a man who runs Harlem and has friends in every high-rise in New York. From the political circles to the civil rights leagues, Mr. Johnson took it personal, the way you handled his family. You been paying attention the last 4 days. The banks calling in debts, partners walking out the door, the protests in the streets, tenants unionizing against you, papers dragging your name, the cold shoulder from high society. That was Mr. Johnson schooling you on the meaning of respect and reminding you that the Civil Rights Act ain't just ink on a page. There's a steep price tag for treating folks the way you treated Mr. Johnson's wife and little girl. Green lays it out plain. He says the color drained right out of Pemberton's mug. The second the reality of the situation hit him, the guy stammers, "That ain't possible. Bumpy Johnson is a hood." Guy just walked out of the federal pen last year. He don't pull strings at banks or country clubs, and he sure don't run civil rights groups. I cut him off right there. Mr. Johnson's got roots in this town you never even knew grew in the dark. He's got ears in every corner. Black, white, Chinese, Italian, Jewish, Puerto Rican. His reach goes a hell of a lot deeper than just the rackets. He bankrolls the fight for rights. He breaks bread with the politicians, the press, the captains of industry, and when a man disrespects his blood, Mr. Johnson calls in every marker he's got to make sure that man wishes he was never born. Wake up to October 1964, Pemberton. That civil rights law has teeth now, and men like Mr. Johnson are going to make sure it bites by guaranteeing that bigots like you pay heavy for the kind of discrimination you thought you could get away with for free. Pemberton begged to know how to stop the bleedin', how to get Johnson to call off the dogs that were tearing his business apart. Green gave him the cold, hard truth. Nothing. You can't unring the bell. Loans are gone. Partners are history. Your tenants are unionized. The activists are camped out on your doorstep. Your name in this town is mud. Mr. Johnson don't want your apologies or your cash. He already did what he came to do, showing you there are catastrophic consequences. For looking down on black folks with that hate you showed on October 10th, mark this down as a costly education on what the Civil Rights Act really stands for. On the street, Pemberton, it means black folks got heavy hitters in their corner now. Men like Mr. Johnson, with the bankroll and the brains to hit back when you come for us. And you ought to thank your lucky stars. Johnson decided to break your business instead of breaking you. Green got up to walk, then dropped Johnson's final decree. One more thing, Pemberton. Mr. Johnson wants it known that his wife and daughter are strolling back into Bergmann Sterling next Saturday, October 17th. They're gonna shop like anyone else. And if anybody, you, your floor bosses, or any other patron, gives them anything less than total deference, the hell you went through this week will look like a vacation compared to what comes next. We clear? Pemberton just gave a stiff nod. Two shook up and beaten down to say a word. On Saturday, October 17th, 1964, 7 days to the hour after the incident, Mayme and Ruthie Johnson walked back into Bergmann and Sterling. At 2:45 in the afternoon, flanked by Theodore Green and William Hullett, who posted up by the doors like sentries but let the ladies handle their business inside. Standing guard outside were about 30 soldiers from Corps and the NAACP, just watching the scene, making damn sure nobody tried anything funny. Witnesses say the second trip went down a whole lot different than the first. The manager met Mayme and Ruthie at the door himself, hat in hand, begging for forgiveness regarding the October 10th mess. They made it clear that Mr. Pemberton was persona non grata at Bergmann and Sterling, permanently exiled from the premises like a bad memory. They swore that all black customers would be treated with the utmost respect, welcomed with open arms, strictly following the Civil Rights Act of 1964. 3 clerks hovered over Mayme and Ruthie for their entire 90-minute visit, laying out the top-shelf merchandise, catering to every whim, treating them with the kind of high-class deference usually kept for the big spenders, ensuring race was no longer part of the equation. Other patrons, including a few faces who witnessed the ugliness on October 10th and stood silent during Pemberton's rant, now bent over backwards to play nice, forcing polite chatter, praising Mayme and Ruthie's style and taste. Their actions screamed that black customers belonged here, and last week's disrespect wouldn't fly again. The shift in atmosphere was night and day, noted Margaret Holbrook, who was back at Bergmann and Sterling that Saturday, watching the whole scene unfold. Last week, those ladies took terrible abuse while we stood like statues, to our disgrace. This week, they were queens. The boss was bowing and scraping, fully attentive. The staff stayed sharp and respectful, and those of us present for the last round made sure to prove, through our conduct, that we wanted no part of Pemberton's mess and that we knew the rules had changed in October 1964. I approached the matriarch, Mrs. Johnson, and offered my regrets for staying silent on October 10th. When the heat was on, she carried herself with class, accepted the apology, and stated her hope that this incident would force a shift for every black shopper who had been shut out or disrespected in joints like this for far too long. Mayme and Ruthie dropped about $1,500 on clothes and accessories during the visit, snagging the evening wear they came for, plus a little extra. The manager handled the wrapping personally and escorted them to the exit, once again atoning for the October 10th disaster and insisting they return. On the street, the Corps and NAACP, soldiers who had been standing watch, applauded as Mayme and Ruthie stepped out, bags in hand. A show of unity, proving black women could walk into exclusive Fifth Avenue boutiques without looking over their shoulders, proving the Civil Rights Act was backed not just by statutes, but by muscle and strategic pressure. As Mayme and Ruthie departed Bergmann Sterling, Hewlett and Green flanked them, walking them to the car, waiting to run them back to Harlem. "How did they treat you, Mrs. Johnson?" Green asked, voice low. With a thin smile, she replied, "Much better than last Saturday." "Thank you, Theodore," Mayme stated, based on Hullett's report to the Observer. "Make sure Bumpy knows his move was appreciated and brutally effective. I think the whole city understands the price of insulting his family now. I'll deliver the message." Green nodded, though he likely already knows. And every other bigot in Manhattan got the memo too. Charles Whitfield Pemberton III never came back from the 72-hour demolition of his empire and reputation. By December 1964, he had to liquidate 14 of his 19 buildings at a bleed, just to cover the called loans and buy out partners running for the hills. His worth cratered from $45 million in October 1964 to $11 million by February 1965, bleeding $34 million in 4 months. The social freeze-out was permanent. Pemberton was exiled from both country clubs, cut off from Manhattan's elite forever. The doors were slammed in his face at every gathering and event. His wife served him walking papers in January 1965, packing her bags for the Connecticut estate and swearing never to return, saying she couldn't show her face in Manhattan society, not after her husband had become the poster boy for hate in this new era of civil rights. Pemberton tried to scrub the stain off his name in 1965 and 66, but the brand was poison. The banks closed their vaults to him. Partners refused to throw a dime his way. Even the tenants steered clear of his buildings, as long as they had somewhere else to go. His heart finally gave out in April 1968 at age 68, a ghost forgotten by the high society that used to toast him as a king of the Manhattan concrete jungle. The job Bumpy pulled on Pemberton became folklore in the streets and the pews alike, says Reverend Mitchell. The wise guys saw it as cold, hard proof that Bumpy Johnson's reach went way past Harlem, that he could bury anyone who crossed him. Didn't matter how fat their wallet or how big their friends were. The activists looked at it as the blueprint for how to swing the Civil Rights Act like a hammer, using the almighty dollar and the people on the street to squeeze the life out of bigoted businessmen, showing guys who thought they were untouchable that they could be broke and shamed. The second they stepped on the wrong toes, Pemberton figured it out way too late. That October 1964 was a whole new world compared to 54. That the Civil Rights Act has fangs, especially when a guy like Bumpy Johnson decides to wield it like a loaded gun against hate. That looking down on black folks with that kind of dirt in your heart comes with a heavy price tag, a price that can torch everything you spent a lifetime building from the ground up. Taking down Charles Pemberton, along with the organization Muscle Johnson bankrolled, and the noise the papers made sent shockwaves through the Manhattan retail and real estate rackets. By late 1964 and through 65, a bunch of those high and mighty shops that were dragging their feet on the new laws, keeping quiet rules to keep black customers out. By giving them the cold shoulder, even if they couldn't slam the door in their faces anymore, started rolling out the red carpet for black shoppers and teaching their staff some respect. Bergmann and Sterling became the poster child for how fast things could flip when the money lined up with the law. They put their first black sales clerk on the floor in November 1964 and started taking out ads in the black papers, promising that everybody gets treated like a king. The other joints on Fifth Avenue fell in line through 65, mostly scared stiff of getting hit by the heavyweights they might accidentally disrespect, and partly because of the heat from the civil rights movement that Johnson helped spark, and partly realizing that locking out black folks with cash in October 1964 was bad for the books and a dangerous gamble with the law. Bumpy didn't care about integrating Manhattan stores, says Green. He just wanted to break the man who hurt his family. But by crushing Pemberton out in the open like that, by showing everyone that running a business with hate in your heart could bankrupt you in this new era, Bumpy accidentally put his foot on the gas for integration across Manhattan's retail and real estate game. Stores opened their doors faster in late 1964 and 65, partly because the law said they had to, but mostly because the suits who saw what happened to Pemberton understood that being a bigot gets expensive when you cross the kind of people who have the muscle and the will to hit back. The Pemberton job became a ghost story for the Manhattan elite. Don't do your dirt in public. Don't disrespect black customers, because you never know who is standing behind them, and you never know what kind of hell might rain down on you. Bumpy Johnson never breathed a word about his part in wiping out Charles Pemberton's empire. When the Observer came sniffing around for a comment, Johnson stayed silent, letting his mouthpiece Theodore Green hand over a statement on October 13, 1964. Mr. Johnson claims he's in the dark regarding Pemberton's business struggles or his social headaches. Johnson is a Harlem man who keeps his eyes on his own plate, with no hand in Manhattan real estate or the private wars of strangers he ain't never met. If Pemberton's wallet is hurting, Johnson advises he go see his bankers and his advisors, instead of pointing fingers at ghosts for his own failures. Johnson stands by the Act of '64, believing all folks are owed equal dignity and proper respect, regardless of race. Any earner who spits on the Civil Rights Act should expect to face the heavy legal and financial heat coming his way. But amongst Johnson's crew, his friends, and his kin, the score was settled and clear as day. Bumpy never spoke a word on Pemberton, says Hewlett. He didn't crow about it, didn't look for the credit, didn't want the kind of press that brings the law knocking, or to tip his hand that he pulled the strings. But Bumpy's people knew the score. Pemberton disrespected Bumpy's wife and girl on October 10th. In 72 hours, his world ended. The link was clear to anyone with eyes, and the warning was just as sharp. Don't cross Bumpy Johnson's family unless you're ready to cash out everything you love. The Civil Rights Act is gospel in October '64, and guys like Bumpy will enforce it by making examples of the racists who think business runs like it used to. July 1964. The word on what went down after October 10th, '64, moved through Harlem, the New York underworld, and the civil rights struggle as a blueprint of how real power is used to guarantee civil rights when the law books alone ain't enough to straighten people out. A rich white racist shamed two black dames in a Fifth Avenue joint on October 10th, '64, blind that they stood with a man who had the muscle to strike back in this new world. Inside a week, that racist dropped $34 million, lost his good name, his business ties, and his seat at the Manhattan table, and two black women went back to the store that saw their shame, where they were welcomed and served with proper respect, where they bought fine clothes, surrounded by white customers, treating them as equals, where the boss offered a personal apology and vowed that history wouldn't repeat. That was the lesson Charles Pemberton learned too late. That October '64 is a new game compared to '54. That the Civil Rights Act rewrote the rules, and that Bumpy Johnson, despite his rap sheet, despite walking out of the feds just 11 months back in November '63, had more muscle to enforce civil rights than most of Manhattan's rich white elite could picture. The insult Pemberton thought he could get away with cost him a lifetime of building and changed the face of shopping in New York City. In the months after the act was signed, it kicked open doors that were once locked, challenged the old ways that seemed set in stone, proving the new law had teeth when men with smarts and deep pockets chose to enforce it through financial warfare, all because Bumpy Johnson knew something Charles Pemberton never figured out. That true power, in October 1964, isn't about who you can hurt for free. It's making sure those who break rights and hurt your people pay a debt they can't afford.